All right. Hey, everybody. We're on the home stretch now. TechCon Day 3. The API Management and Gateways track is flying today. Great content. I'm your host, Brian Wilson. I hope you got a chance to be inspired by the fascinating perspectives that Adam had to offer. And a couple things before we get started. Don't forget, ask questions in the chat. Please give us some interactivity and get your questions answered. If you can't get them answered during the session or more complex question, whole topic that you want to discuss, please join us on the office hours, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time after the last session, where hopefully you can get any of your questions answered or again, dive into a topic of discussion. And then finally, at the end of the session, don't forget, answer those poll questions, the survey on the feedback for the session, the conference, so we can keep improving everything that we're doing for you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris and Anita. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. Good morning and good afternoon to you all. Hope you're enjoying the API management and gateway sessions here and have learned some exciting things in the last few days. And here's one more session on business platform engagement. I am Nandini, a product manager on API Connect and Gateway, and I have Chris Dudley with me, our architect, and we're so excited to bring you business platform engagement for deep and enriching digital experiences. So let's jump right into the agenda. We are going to discuss how does having notifications differentiate your experience as a customer. And this is really key considering this impacts your day-to-day outside of specific technologies you use, and hence it has a measurable impact on your business itself. We'll look at API Connect subsystems and where engagement sits in. How would different personas that interact with API management solutions use engagement? What are some of the compelling business cases for business use cases for engagement, and how it delivers value for your business for deepening and enriching your API management experience? And then we're also going to see some pretty solid stats from having real-time notifications. And finally, the fun part, Chris is going to walk you through the feature with some demo scenarios around posting to Slack, alerting on monitoring tools like PagerDuty, and then triggering an escalation workflow for your org and engaging with AI-driven APIs on the AI gateway using watsonx. So in a digital day and age, APIs are fundamental to your digital experience, right? So from booking an Uber to, say, a flight you take and your monetary transactions between the two, all of the workings are exchanging payloads between endpoints that happens by the interaction of APIs. So imagine a scenario where we had to bring you this TechCon session and you didn't know about this one. Or we didn't know about we didn't know about when we were scheduled and nobody turned up. And then it's not a fear of missing out anymore. It's the fear that turns into reality, and that's dreadful. Extrapolate this to a business scenario and to business interactions between organizations and having to fly blind, or not having a consistent and unified approach to gathering all the business insights in one place such that you can take actionable decisions. That's the foundation of business platform engagement. Imagine another scenario. Let's say you take a long flight, fly across time zones, and after 15 hours, you land on foreign soil, go into the terminal, and find something to pick up to eat because you're kind of starving. And just at that point, your card fails you. You try again, and the same thing. And you come to find out that your card is not activated for international travel, and you can't use it anywhere on that airport. Now let's reverse that nightmare. Real-time banking notifications that instead notify you to take care of this before you embark on your travel make such a huge difference to how you feel as a customer at the end of that experience. And banking has taken a huge leap and progress in empowering customers with notifications and altering these digital experiences positively. So we see that banking, healthcare, finance, government, and some of the most important markets that we operate in really make a substantive impact by notifying on events to take actions in real time. And that's the unified premise of platform engagement. So that's what we're going to talk to you about today. I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of this in the last few sessions, but let's take a look at how API Connect subsystems interact and where engagement sits exactly. So we have the developer toolkit, which is essentially the API design module to create, test, and validate APIs. And then we have the Drupal interface dev portal that is used to ultimately socialize these APIs by publishing them. And the traffic is managed by the gateway that enforces custom and org policies. At the center of all of this is the API manager, which is used to tie in the experience through all the other subsystems to manage your APIs. Now, the API event data that's surfaced from an OpenSearch distributed engine is gathered to reflect on the dashboards, and this gives you a rundown of performance, response latency, etc., that can be used to set engagement rules from. So analytics and engagement are designed to feed intelligence into each other and surface business critical data to improve insights accordingly and thereby. So we understand the role of API providers and consumers in specific scenarios and the different hats they wear in an organization. So if you're someone who's wearing any of these hats, these roles should be familiar, and these are some use cases core API management personas get immensely impacted by. So if I am Siobhan, an API developer working on hundreds of APIs across departments in a day, I would like to notify my members in my org every time there's a new API published to aid discovery or to initiate other workflows like approvals for a new API. As an API product manager, Steve is the face of the product for his customers, and one of his biggest challenges is managing communication. So a very compelling problem is to make sure the traffic eventually gets directed to the right API without disrupting experience when there is a deprecation or retirement. So as Steve, I can mobilize notifications to do this exactly. As well, in a world of business interactions between thousands of APIs and operations and a commitment to high availability SLAs, an outage is a make or break deal. So Will would like to set a rule on, say, 6 subsequent HTTP timeouts in 1 minute with a retry window of 10 seconds, and he can use engagement to do this exact thing. As an app developer, if my app is subscribed to a plan and the subscription is expiring, I would like to be notified ahead in time. So as Andre, I would really need a rule that triggers, say, before 10 days or 15 days, and I can set it to fire every day as a recurring reminder till this is taken care of. So going back to the card activation scenario for international travel, we all need reminders once in a while. As the CISO or security admin, another make or break is losing visibility to financial transactions in embargoed countries and receiving an alert if there is some risky action, thereby notifying or using engagement to notify for alerting in such a scenario. So tying these business use cases, let's look at how engagement ties these loose ends and brings a 360-degree vision into your business KPIs and decisions. Subscription has a revenue impact. The ability to impact monetization via consumer subscription or withdrawal of subscription for an API provider has immense business impact. The second one is rate limiting. So when we talk about rate limiting, I kind of remember a lesson from my first database class that started with my professor writing every query has an associated cost on the whiteboard. Surfacing API consumption metrics at every stage leading to maximum usage threshold for the plan is an important business insight for consumers and providers, which is something that they need to keep an eye on continuously. And engagement allows you to have setting different thresholds and notifying at different stages of your usage as to how close you are to that max plan or hitting that max limit. Performance, making sure your APIs are responsive, light, and performant every time they're interacted with determines how seamless the round-trip digital experience will feel. Now, it's the insight that comes from building this 360-degree observability sphere that enables effective business decisions in real time. So engagement allows you to hook up data to your internal monitoring and alerting systems with a variety of supported mechanisms, such as firing a webhook, a Slack pop-up, or a PagerDuty alert to trigger a workflow or trigger an escalation. This is how engagement allows us to generate a tightly personalized social experience for API providers and consumers. And this drives retention on the platform. We're going to look at some numbers shortly. Continuous monitoring of API performance and policy adherence for new and existing API is critical for critical intelligence for governance, security, and analytics. And engagement can be used to identify threats, performance issues, and bottlenecks for optimization that are really key indicators for your business. So let's look at how engagement is ultimately tying this digital experience by providing all of this business value. So from an integrations expert to an architect, an engagement-led approach is crucial for cohesive API management beyond traditional solutions. How? It's a unified, consistent notifications framework for an omni-channel experience. It allows you the ability to control thresholds and access based on provider and consumer roles, and this simplifies the idea of API management. You have the flexibility to set data sources and integrate with a target destination for your service connectors, which is offering you observability beyond what traditional API management does, and the ability to serve notifications in real time through all the data from the gateway, analytics, discovery, etc., delivers a wholesome and differentiated experience. The service connectors that we are supporting are posting to Slack, firing a webhook, triggering a PagerDuty workflow. We can also publish these events to a Kafka topic that listeners can subscribe to or hook it up to IBM's MQ for secure communication between applications and subsystems. We'll have an SMTP connector soon to send out email notifications, and that will be part of the supported service connectors as well. And with integration products being able to send data to analytics, business critical events can be leveraged by event endpoint management and App Connect, for instance, for communication. So it ties other subsystems from the integration portfolio. So to tie the value of engagement to business feeding into the customer experience, there's a lifecycle change or an API performance metric that's impacted. The data is available in analytics. It creates a business insight. And by moving a KPI or a set of KPIs, it can be actioned upon or not actioned upon by engagement to influence the KPI positively. So on this slide, we have an example of an API with a high error rate that can use engagement for rectification. Or on your far right, you see consumer orgs that have different applications. Some of them are orphaned applications with no subscriptions, and some of them are with no traffic. And these APIs can use engagement, or these consumer orgs can use engagement for course correction depending on what will positively influence that KPI. With this, we see that business platform engagement has delivered elevated enterprise connectivity, and here are some real-world stats for its impact. So with over 200 million growing APIs, with API sprawl being a real challenge, it's a top priority for elite and top API management platforms to stay competitive and to have visibility around these APIs. So real-time actionable systems have driven up the enterprise software business ROI by 180 to 200%, and data shows that there's 2x growth in socialization with using real-time notifications in an engagement platform that bolsters deep and enriching socialization and engagement between API providers, consumers, and tie businesses together. So with that, we'll get to the fun part. Chris will run you through some of these scenarios and talk about how to use this, and you can actually see this in our engagement feature. Cool. Take it away, Chris.
So I've got a couple of example scenarios. They are somewhat artificial, as all demos and stages and examples and stuff tend to be, but they show a couple of the features that we kind of want to see with engagement. It's important to say that engagement is not just simple webhooks. It's not just when an action fires, do some follow-up action. It's more intelligent than that. So it's not just cause and effect, but it's cause and then some intelligent analysis. So you can aggregate and do bucketing and all sorts of advanced features like that. So it's not just when one thing happens, it might be when that thing happens and it's on a certain day of the week and this other thing happens, and start combining together quite complicated scenarios so you don't trigger things unnecessarily. The idea being that you make those alerts as intelligent as possible and tightly focused. So the example scenario we'll start with first is a relatively simple one. It's if there are a load of errors on our APIs, we want to alert our SRE team to come and have a look at the problem and see what it is. SRE teams don't tend to like being paged unnecessarily and don't tend to like being paged for the same thing repeatedly. So we want to try and avoid false alarms. We want to be sure there really is a problem. It's not just an outlier. And once we've told them there's a problem, we don't want to keep telling them the same problem again and again. So we're going to go and create a destination. So the way this works in engagement is you create a destination that represents your target endpoint, what you want to happen when all of your criteria are met. So I'm going to create a destination here using corporate PagerDuty. We are the Acme core. So we've got a PagerDuty instance. I've gone and created an application on external PagerDuty that gives me the routing key for that integration. I plug it in here and click save. And now I can go and create a rule. And this is where the interesting bit happens. So we fill it in, we give it a title. At the moment, there's only one rule type, but this is a feature we're planning to extend and make more and more sophisticated as releases go by. So we then specify the schedule, how often do we want it to run, and you can pick either an interval, which is what I'm going to use here, or you could use a cron string. If you had something you only wanted to run at 9:30 on a Wednesday, for example, you can do that. But we're going to set this to run every minute, because we really want to make sure our SRE team know as soon as there is a problem. We then have to pick a data source. So this is where you're selecting what type of data it is you want to act on. The main one that I suspect most customers are going to use to start with will be API events. These are the raw transactional data from analytics. There are a couple of other data sources that you can use as well. There's long-term summary data. If you wanted to do something based on, say, long-term trends, like comparing this quarter's API call volume to last quarter's, then you might be looking at long-term summary data, and you might have something that only runs every 30 days or something rather than every minute, for example. But you can also use data from config sync. So if you're using the config sync utility to replicate consumer data between different API-C stacks or between different catalogs, then you can use the outcome of those sync runs. That data gets logged to analytics. We can then act on that data. So for example, if you wanted to monitor that replication and be alerted when it failed, or when it replicated either more than you were expecting or less than you were expecting, then that data is available too. The more interesting one is probably the analytics data, because that has the most amount of fields and so the most amount of things we can do with it, at least at this point in time. So this is where we get to the slightly more intelligent bit. So we're not just triggering every time there's an API call comes in, because that would flood PagerDuty. So we're going to pick a metric. In this case, nice simple one. We just want to count how many records there are. So how many API events that match our selection criteria. We're going to look over all of the events in the last 10 minutes, but we only want the ones where the HTTP status code started with 500 as a string. So status code is a string rather than integer, because the actual HTTP error you get is 500 internal server error. So we'll just check for ones that start with 500. But we're going to group by API name. So we only want errors when there are multiple errors for a same API, which would suggest there is some problem with that API, rather than, say, having 3 or 5 errors spread over a series of different APIs, which might be just anomalies. We want to make sure there really is some kind of consistency to the problem before we start paging out our SRE team. So then on the next page, we now need to decide what happens when those criteria are met. So we can create a number of triggers, and for each of those triggers, you can have a number of actions. So we're going to create a trigger here where we're going to say if there are more than 2 records that meet the criteria we just specified, so more than 2 HTTP 500 errors for a single API in a 10-minute window, then fire this action. And so this will be sending a severity 3, which is, you can pick any number between 1 and 5, but that value is passed on to the endpoint. So in this case, we could have multiple ones that sent PagerDuty alerts at different severity levels, and then in PagerDuty, your SRE team can set their notification privileges preferences based on those severity. So a Sev5 might just send an email, a Sev1 might start sending push notifications and setting off sirens and alerts and things. So having set the trigger condition, we're now going to add an action. So we are going to call this one 2 errors found, very imaginatively. We're going to pick the destination we created earlier, the one for PagerDuty. We're going to enable throttling, because if we don't, then this will run every minute, and so it'll keep sending them alert every minute until the problem goes away, and that's probably not what we want. So we'll throttle it, so at the most we'll only send them 1 alert for the same problem every 5 minutes. We then get a series of fields which are specific to PagerDuty. They're part of the PagerDuty API. You get source, component, group, and class. These fields, they are just strings from an API-C point of view, but those values get passed through to PagerDuty. And then in PagerDuty, you could use it to route to different ops teams, different SRE teams. Also, you get the statistics, so you could start tracking which alerts get fired more often, or however you choose to use those attributes in PagerDuty. And the payload down the bottom is purely what message you'd like to put in the alert that goes to PagerDuty, hopefully being as informative as possible, which you could argue in this case, I wasn't really hugely descriptive. But then, having created our rule, that's essentially it. We're done. We just have to then wait for it to fire, which through the magic of a demo. Oh, okay, final bit. In this case, I created 2 triggers. So we've got one at Sev 3 and one at Sev 1. So a critical one where they've got different selection criteria. So the top one, Sev 3, is saying if there are 2 API events that meet the criteria, 2 ATP 500 errors, and the one is if there are more than 10. And that would then trigger a Sev 1 alert. And if they fire, this is what happens. So this is now looking in PagerDuty. You can see in my PagerDuty instance, you can see the alert that got triggered. So the message there is what I provided on the previous screen. So there have been at least 2 ATP 500 errors. Please investigate. And also those fields we provided for source, component, group and class are all passed through. And these are all the full details that you can see that you could then act on and then act on it in PagerDuty as normal. Really, it's standard PagerDuty alerting. The other thing you can do as a provider is see the history of these. So obviously you get the history of the alerts in PagerDuty itself, but we'll show you the history in engagement too. So for each rule, you can come along and then look at the history of that rule and when the alerts are fired. So in this case, I created 2 triggers, but only one of them's actually ever fired. So you can see down the bottom, it's only got 1 trigger listed. That's the only one that fired. And you can see when it is fired on the graph, and you can zoom in, pick different time frames, all of that sort of usual stuff. Second scenario. So in this case, we're going to post to Slack. We don't want to page people out. We're just more interested in some more active monitoring to show people when there's a problem, but maybe that problem isn't one that needs immediate action. It's just for visibility. So in this case, we'll look at the latency of API calls. And so the scenario here is, you might be posting saying our gateways are slowing down. Maybe you need to start scaling out the number of gateways, or maybe we need to look at doing some throttling, or some other cause is causing problems. Maybe a load balancer in front is running slowly. So it's just alerting that there is a problem, and then people could go and look into it. So we go and create a new destination here, and we'll type Slack. So it's remarkably similar to the PagerDuty one, but obviously it's specific to the Slack API. So now we've got our token that is for the application that I registered with Slack, and the channel ID. So everyone who's used to Slack will be used to channels having names. Unfortunately, names are not unique, so their Slack API doesn't accept them. You have to use channel IDs, but it's simple. You can get that from any Slack channel. When you go and click on the channel at the top, it has a copy channel ID button. You can click and copy, and then it will fire the messages straight through. If we now go and create the rule for this, it's again remarkably similar. This we're going to run once an hour. It's not active alerting. It's not about there being consumers being affected. It's just a kind of a gradual slowdown. So for this case, we'll just run once an hour. Again, we're selecting API events. This is all based on the transactional data from the gateways, but instead of just doing a count of how many records, here we want to actually get the back-end system to do some of the aggregation and do the hard work for us. So we want to look at the mean of the time to serve request field. So the average of essentially the total latency for each API event that gets served by the gateway. It tracks that in milliseconds. We want to again grab the average of those in a 1 hour time period. We only care about successful API calls here. Errors could be handled either much faster or much slower, because either it could be 401 or 403, which would be rejected very, very quickly, or it could be a timeout at the back end, so it would skew our data. So in this case, to try and ensure some kind of consistency and check we're only doing this when there's really a problem, we'll only select the successful calls. But again, we're going to group by API name to try and give some kind of consistency, because the average time to serve requests can often differ by API, because of the different policies in those APIs. Creating of the trigger, so we'll make this one a critical for no other reason than why not. and we're going to trigger it if the average latency is greater than 5,000 milliseconds. And when that happens, it's just going to post that message at the bottom to Slack. It really is as simple as that. Again, we're going to put throttling on because we don't want to be posting to Slack again and again repeatedly. So it'll only do it once each hour. Otherwise, we'd end up flooding and spamming Slack channels, which is not normally a way to make friends. And when that happens, that's what it looks like. It pops out and pops a message into Slack. And so you can do all your usual things with funky emojis and all the usual magic things that you can do in Slack. It really is as simple as that. It's using the proper Slack API, so it has all of the possibilities that are documented in the Slack API. The last scenario is slightly different. As Nandini mentioned, the types of destinations that you can use with engagement. We have built-in integration for PagerDuty and Slack. There are generic webhook types, which you can use for anything that accepts HTTP. So you can use it for IBM MQ, you can use it for Kafka through the use of the Kafka bridge and the MQ HTTP input. But it could be anything. It could be an App Connect flow with then all the hundreds of connectors that you get with App Connect, or it could just be a custom microservice. So in this scenario, I've got a custom microservice, which I'm using to manage my whatsanext.ai subscription. So I'm using the AI gateway feature in API Connect that allows me to have a single subscription for whatsanext.ai. It allows me to have a certain number of tokens that I can use, call it 100,000 a day, and I can then allow my consumers access to that API without them having to have access to the AI credentials themselves. And it means I can then track their usage of it, and I could then bill them for their share of the overall back-end service. But obviously I need to monitor their usage of it, because however many tokens they use adds up to my total as the provider. So what I want to happen here is to keep an eye on the total token usage each day, and if that goes above a certain threshold, it'll trigger my custom microservice on the back end, which would then invoke whatsanext.ai's subscription API to then increase my plan rate limit, at which point I'd then be ready for the following day. Otherwise, whatsanext would start rate limiting me and my consumers would start getting errors. So I go and create a destination of type webhook. Remarkably simple. Put in a URL. You can add whatever headers and things you want to it, and then you click save. That's essentially all there is to the destination. Obviously, this is just an example URL, but you could put whatever HTTP or HTTPS endpoint you wanted in there. We then go and create a rule. So again, we're based on API events, but the AI gateway feature sends through transactions with a few additional fields set on them. And initially one there is the AI total tokens. So that's both how many request and response tokens they used. We can get the back end of engagement to add those together for all of the AI calls within a certain time period. So here we're going to run this once a day, and we're going to check if the total for that day's AI was AI calls was greater than 100,000. If so, then invoke our backend endpoint. You can see I didn't enable throttling at this point. It's only running once a day. That wasn't really necessary. It wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference here, as long as I only had the rule run once. And maybe in this case, you would want it to run on a cron, maybe running at midnight or something overnight. The payload is JSON, so this is firing an actual API. So rather than just being plain text, we're sending JSON through, and I've put what the total tokens are, so in case my custom microservice could take different numerical values, then you could feed those through. The double parentheses on the second line is using one of the context variables that we have. So this was purely just so that maybe my backend, my custom microservice would be logging how often it gets called, so I could keep an audit log of when these things happened, and you'd know what day effectively this fired. There's a group of about 10 to 15 different context variables for various different things that you can use when your rules fire. But essentially, that's basically it would then fire and trigger the rule change. These are very slightly artificial examples of what you can do with engagement. There are about 60 to 80, I think, attributes we have for API events in analytics. These are only the data sources we have today. We are looking at what other ones we could add. Potential ideas would be doing things based on audit events or based on test run data. So if test executions fail overnight, maybe you want something to happen. It could be based on API discovery or governance for compliance checks. There's all sorts of interesting things that happen in an API management platform, and it's just trying to work out how we can then create the trigger points for those to then fire external aggregations. This is the first step. There are more steps to come, but this is the first step from APIC moving from being polling based. So API Connect has always had very full APIs that allow you to access most of the functionality and allow you to, well, all of the functionality and allow you to pull data out, but they've been REST APIs. They haven't been event driven. This is our first steps into then being event driven, so that now when things happen in your API platform, you can trigger external systems, and it allows much better and tighter integration, so that now your external systems can be told exactly when something happens rather than having to poll and check. They'll be able to be told straight away. So if this is an area that's of interest to you, if you have example use cases or areas you want us to add and tackle next, please do let us know. We're actively trying to invest in this, and we want to make sure we target the higher priority scenarios first. So if there's a particular data source or type of data that you'd would be interesting for you, please do let us know. If we have any questions, then we can take them now, or we're happy to take them at the business hours call in an hour or two. If people want to do it slightly more informally later, whatever's easiest.
Yeah, so thank you, guys. Any questions? Again, we've got a few minutes here, so feel free to ask a question now if you want to, or as Chris said, absolutely either way. You know, feel free to also join the office hours, 2:30 p.m. Eastern.
I can't see what questions were, if there were any, in
There weren't
the
any.
chat thing.
No, there
I
weren't any.
have been looking at the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I don't think we've had any so far, but as Chris mentioned, please do bring in use cases, questions, anything, any scenario that you have come across that you think engagement will be an intelligent solution for. And that's the goal here. So, yeah.
All right, perfect. Great information. Thank you. So down to one more session. So that will start at 1:25. And so you've got just a few minutes, grab a coffee or drink, whatever, and settle in for that last session. Hope to see you there. And again, hope to see you at office hours. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.